Back in the 1950s, Iran had a proper democracy, elected leaders, independent parliament, all of that jazz. But in 1953, the United States and Britain tore it all down. But why did they do this? Was it to protect the people from a newly elected brutal regime? Nah, of course not. But it was because the newly elected leader, Mohammad Mossadegh, did something very dangerous. He nationalised Iranian oil, meaning the profits were given to Iranian people and not to foreign companies for the first time. I know, outrageously selfish. And after this coup, he was replaced with the previous leader of Iran, the Shah, who was Western allied and is a major reason the Islamic Revolution happened 26 years later, which created a government that is still in power today. Now let's explain how and why this all happened, and why it led to the Islamic Revolution. Without further ado, this is the story of Operation Ajax. Let's rewind a bit. So in 1951, Mohammad Mossadegh became Prime Minister of Iran, chosen by Parliament and backed by massive public support. He wasn't a radical, he wasn't a communist, he was a secular nationalist who believed Iranians should have control over Iranian resources, specifically oil. In fact, his party, the National Front, was a coalition of multiple political forces, including liberal nationalists, social democrats and even some moderate conservatives. Arguably the most important policy of this party was to reduce foreign influence, notably the British. But here's the issue. Britain was controlling Iran's oil, and they had been since the early 1900s. At the time, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which later became BP, was making insane profits, whilst Iranian workers were being paid, well, basically pennies, to extract the black gold from their own land. In fact, the difference in where the profits were going was so stark that in 1947, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company reported post-tax profits of £40 million, but Iran got only 7 million of that. That's 17.5% of the total profits. So Mossadegh did what any sensible leader would do. He nationalised the oil industry in order to ensure that the profits from their oil weren't extracted to foreign companies. To Iranians, this was a moment of pride. For the first time there was hope that the profits of the work they were doing may end up in their own pockets and into the infrastructure and public services in their own country. But to the British government, however, an outrage. This represented the rapid decline of the empire, and they were pretty pissed. So, the British government, under Churchill, demanded that Mossadegh reverse the nationalisation. He refused. Britain then responded with economic sanctions, a global boycott of Iranian oil, and even told British staff working on the oil refineries to disable and sabotage equipment, as well as take important maintenance records and blueprints with them, you know, a bit like a toddler throwing a tantrum. But Mossadegh and his government refused to back down. So Britain turned to their increasingly powerful mate from across the Atlantic, the USA, and begged for them to help overthrow the Iranian government. In fact, President Truman refused to participate and advocated for a diplomatic and peaceful solution. However, in 1953, President Eisenhower was elected and was significantly more anti-communist. Britain took this advantage and pitched the idea as a way to prevent communism from spreading, claiming that Mossadegh was dangerously close to communism, which was completely untrue but a perfect excuse during the Cold War period. Nevertheless, Eisenhower agreed in mid-1953, and by August that very same year, the M16 and the CIA were executing the coup, known as Operation Ajax. Operation Ajax was led on the ground by Kermit Roosevelt Jr., the CIA's man in Tehran, and yep, grandson of President Teddy Roosevelt. His job was to build connections with a group of pro-Shah military officers in order to build up a powerful military force, bribe Iranian officials to switch sides, pay people to pose as both pro-Mossadegh and pro-Shah protesters in order to create chaos and violence, and pay newspapers to claim Mossadegh was a Soviet puppet. And eventually, on August 15th, 1953, after they had finished all their prep work and warmed up with numerous violent protests, they executed the coup, forcibly removing Mossadegh from power. During the coup, 200 to 300 people were killed in street fighting between the forces of the Shah and supporters of Mossadegh. And due to the Shah's forces receiving weaponry from the US, they were able to beat Mossadegh supporters relatively easily. After the Shah's forces got through all the Mossadegh supporters, and after attacking and raiding Mossadegh's home, they eventually arrested him, his government was dismantled, and the US and Britain reinstalled the previous Shah into power, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, a Western-friendly autocrat who would rule Iran with an iron fist for the next 25 years. So what happened next? Well, the Shah's regime became increasingly brutal, with torture, a secret police organisation which was called Savak, political repression, and Mossadegh spending the rest of his life under house arrest. In fact, the saying, Rival mush darer, mushum gosh darer, which translates roughly to the wall has mice and the mice have ears, was said to describe the intense fear and surveillance under the Shah's regime. And all of this was backed by Washington and London, because they didn't care about what life was like for Iranians, as after the Shah's return, the oil industry was redivided up between Western companies, meaning they still got their cut. But why did it lead to the Islamic Revolution? Well, if a foreign power shuts down your democracy and elected government, replaces it with a yes man for those same foreign powers, suppresses every form of peaceful dissent and silences the people, you create a pressure cooker that's waiting to explode. And guess what? It did. By the late 1970s, the Iranian people had had enough, and the man who turned this anger into action was Ayatollah Khomeini. He led the revolution in 1979, which was massive, millions in the street, the Shah fled, and the Islamic Republic was born. But it didn't have to go this way. If the West hadn't interfered in 1953, if Iran's democracy had been allowed to grow, they may have ended up with a secular democratic government and not a theocracy. So this coup wasn't just an event in Iranian history, it fundamentally changed Iran's future. It handed power to tyrants, destroyed hope for democracy, and paved the way for an authoritarian regime followed by another authoritarian regime. And all that for oil. And do you know what the worst part is? The US realised that military coups work, and boy did they use them. In fact, the US went on to overthrow 14 other democratically elected governments from all over the world over the next 6 decades. And this is the first part of a 15-part series where I'll be discussing every single one of these cases, with the next one being the Guatemala coup in 1954, yes, only 1 year later, otherwise known as the Banana Coup. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed, please subscribe and stay tuned for the next part in the series, which is every democracy the US has successfully overthrown.